Who would you say was Mac's biggest influence, mentor?
I'd say without a doubt Bill Onus. What Bruce McGuinness was to me as a mentor, Bill Onus was to Bruce McGuinness. Bill Onus is one of the unheralded heroes in my mind of the Aboriginal political struggle of the last 50 to 80 years. Both he and Doug Nicholls were born in 1906 at the same place, Cummeragunja. They spent their childhood at Cummeragunja, and then it seems they both moved in different directions. Doug Nicholls went the way of Christianity and was inspired by William Cooper and a more, might I say it, conservative line of political activism, whereas Bill Onus moved north into the western New South Wales, where he met people in the Shearers Union. He met Jack Patton, Bill Ferguson, great Aboriginal heroes in western New South Wales, who themselves had learned their politics from the Shearers Union, the AWU, and to a certain extent the Communist Party. And so in certain ways Bill Onus represents the left of the Aboriginal movement, the history of the left of the Aboriginal movement, and Doug Nicholls possibly represents the middle or conservative stream of the Aboriginal movement. And in 1967, Bill became the first Aboriginal director of the Aborigines Advancement League in Melbourne, at the same time as Doug became the first Aboriginal employee, field officer of the league. Within a year or so, Bruce joined the league initially as a field officer and was eventually, after Bill Onus's death in 1968, he became the first Aboriginal director of the Aborigines Advancement League. Now, Bill Onus, I personally believe that Bill Onus's fingerprints are all over a lot of the political moves and shifts that occurred after his death, particularly in the life of McGuinness. I mean, McGuinness got into making films. He saw that as an important means of communicating the message that they were about. I believe he learnt that from the experience of Bill Onus and knowing what Bill had done with the films that he made, because I believe that Bill made a film shot footage with Doug Nicholls in Western Australia about the conditions for Aboriginal people there, which led to a lot of political agitation in the East after they'd shown it. I believe that in the sort of left-wing nature of Bill Onus's politics, that clearly came out in McGuinness and through the people who McGuinness mentored, including myself. I mean, in certain ways, I regard myself in the long term as another product of the work that Bill Onus did. I mean, he's as much an inspiration to me the more I find out about him and know about him as what Bruce was, because I can see in a lot of the work that Bruce did, him sort of applying the lessons that he'd learned from Bill, you know, in the way in which he did things and the stuff that he did. Bill Onus was the founder of the Redfern All Blacks Football Club, which not many people know. Bruce McGuinness, I could never understand in the beginning, when I first met McGuinness, why he had such an obsession with the Fitzroy Stars Football Club in Melbourne, which is the Melbourne Aboriginal equivalent of the Redfern All Blacks. But gradually I got to understand that McGuinness had picked up from Bill Onus that a football team is an important way to maintain cohesion of a community that is under threat from assimilation. It was a way of keeping a community together. It was giving them something that they could identify with, something that the identity of the community was mixed up in, and that because it's an Aboriginal team, people are relating to it because we're Aboriginal, sort of thing. And it was a source of pride and dignity and strength, and as Kenny Brindle had earlier showed, a good sort of way of politically organising people sometimes, you know. And I reckon Bruce's involvement with the Fitzroy Stars in part stemmed from that. It's also because a lot of his relatives played for the team. And so, there were many ways, I think, that Bill Onus's fingerprints are all over the work of McGuinness. That's not to detract from any of McGuinness's work at all. In fact, in many ways, Bruce sort of refined the techniques and the ideas of Bill Onus. But Bill Onus is still very much one of the most important influences in the modern-day Aboriginal political struggle.
Sweet. I'm going to just move on to... I think that we've covered everything there. Move on to the community organisation course.
In 1965, a scholarship was offered for £500 if there was an Aboriginal person with a leaving certificate from high school. It was a scholarship to attend Swinburne College of Technology, 1965. The search eventually had to be extended beyond Victoria because there was nobody in Victoria, no Aboriginal person with a leaving certificate in 1965. In fact, there were only 176 Aboriginal children in high school in Victoria in 1965. 10 years later, Bruce McGuinness set up, in association with John Morrison, who was teaching at Swinburne College, the same Swinburne College, a program which was funded by the federal government ostensibly to take unemployable Aboriginal people, give them a 12-month basic sort of skills training program and make them employable. That was the theory. As soon as Bruce McGuinness started there, he rapidly transformed it into a program which took the same group of people, what were defined by white Australia as unemployable, and in 12 months put them through this intense political education program whereby equip them with or give them an analysis of their own history and why they are poor and why they are in the situation they are today, and then equip them with a range of organising skills, setting up organisations, organising community meetings, all this sort of practical stuff, and then turn them loose 12 months later in the Victorian community. To this day, some of the best community leaders in this state and beyond, and some of the best administrators of Aboriginal organisations throughout this state have been people who graduated from that 3-year program in 1975 to 1978. Bruce McGuinness invited me down the first year he started it to do a guest lecture, and after taking one look at what was going on there, I thought, wow, this is great. So I moved in and joined him and became a lecturer on the course. And it was probably many people will tell you that it was one of the most brilliant experiments in Aboriginal education in the history of Victoria and possibly Australia. And it only came to an end when Malcolm Fraser, our dearly beloved Prime Minister, good on you, Mal, when Malcolm Fraser's government realised what we were up to, because there was a increase in the amount of political agitation happening around Victoria. And I think some bureaucrat somewhere sitting in his little ivory tower must have realised what was going on, because the program closed down when Malcolm Fraser cut off the money. But that was okay, because within a couple of years we revived the program again in Collingwood as a place called Koori College, which in itself was another important phase in the development of an independent Aboriginal education programs.
Sweet, you're doing bloody well here, thank you. Do you want to explain Koori College just briefly? Alan covered it before a lot.
Well, I think one of the important things to understand, something I didn't mention when you asked me what comes to mind when you mentioned McGuinness. One of the great things that he was a great educationalist. And in fact, there are literally hundreds of people around Australia who will tell you that they either participated in education programs that he initiated or had some association with them. And I believe that's one of the great things that McGuinness taught me. One of the things that interests me most today is, like last semester at the University of Melbourne, I taught a subject in the politics department. And there's an enormous sense of satisfaction to be gained from encouraging people to think for themselves, which is the thing that McGuinness was about in education. He wasn't interested in imposing his own ideas on others. What he was about was making people realise that you are capable of figuring things out for yourself, and if you're provided with the means of knowing how to track down the information you need to come to your own conclusion, and that's the way to do it. And so he was all about people being encouraged to believe in their own self-education. It's one of the earliest things he taught me, and something that I saw him do with other people all his life.
Thanks, Lou.
So what was the NACC?
The National Aboriginal Consultative Committee was the earliest version of ATSIC, if you like. It was a national elected body set up by the Whitlam government. And the interesting thing about the NACC compared to ATSIC is that the NACC was elected on an Aboriginal roll. They actually went round and created an Aboriginal roll, electoral roll, nationally. So there was no question mark over who could vote or who couldn't. You're Aboriginal or you're not, and you voted. That also resulted in the highest level of voter participation in that sort of body. So the NACC was a very credible body with a mandate. Unfortunately, it was only ever an advisory body. But Bruce McGuinness was elected the first chairperson of the NACC. And that's pretty significant in itself, because the people who voted him in were the people who'd been elected from the various localities around Australia. So it was, if you like, a national expression of confidence in the sort of ideas and the philosophies that Mac espoused at that time, which in itself is very significant. We're talking 1974. And that, in effect, means that the majority of the elected representatives of Aboriginal Australia nationally in 1974 supported the strong position that McGuinness took on things like self-determination. I mean, he was still calling it black power, you know, so that was pretty remarkable. And his role as chairperson was marked with intense controversy, in part because the ministers for Aboriginal Affairs in the Whitlam government, the Labor government, did not like the ideas that the likes of McGuinness were saying. I mean, one of the great ironies of history is that it is my contention that in my lifetime, the governments that have done more damage to Aboriginal Australia have been the Labor governments rather than the Conservative governments. And the Whitlam case is a classic example. McGuinness got into a major brawl with the then Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Senator Kavanagh. Kavanagh, to this day, probably remains the worst Minister for Aboriginal Affairs there has ever been. And that's really some statement, given, you know, the low quality of the vast majority of them. But Kavanagh was eventually left, and but McGuinness was a very active chairperson of the NAC, and I think there are many people who'd say that the leadership, the national leadership role that he assumed then, was an extremely important one in terms of the period and the times. And it was right up until 1978 that McGuinness remained very eminent nationally, because at the same time he was also became chairperson of the National Aboriginal Islander Health Organisation, which is another incredibly important body in history, one which is largely ignored by mainstream historians, one which, if you look at the newspaper reports of that period, clearly show that the preeminent national political organisation was NAHO. Now, McGuinness was chairperson of that throughout that. But then in, I think it was 1978, he had a really serious car accident, in which he almost got killed, and which took him many years to recover from, especially psychologically, I think. And it was in the context of the aftermath of that accident, and coinciding with work that I was doing in Europe at the time, that I talked him into coming with me on a trip to England and Europe with a specific purpose of setting up an Aboriginal Information Centre in London to put pressure on the Australian government back home. We'd learnt the lesson that Australian governments do respond to international unfavourable public opinion, and so we decided to turn the blowtorch on Mal Fraser and set up a centre in London, which we eventually did. And it was part of trying to get Bruce through the problem of his accident that we went on that trip. And it was a highly successful trip. We went to many places. He loved Amsterdam, as did I. Can't imagine why. We spent a lot of time in Germany, France, Denmark, and England. And we set up an Aboriginal Information Centre in London with support committees in every country in Western Europe, with the exception, I think it was Sweden, Portugal, Spain and Greece. A pretty extraordinary amount of work, which was later followed up on by Bindi Williams and Smedley and others. Sorry, brother, I forgot. Tommy Smith and others. And which in turn, put enormous pressure on the Australian government. I mean, it was a great success in terms of what we wanted it to do, which was to try and wring concessions out of the Australian government.
And are there be newspaper stuff about it?
Extensive.
Excellent.
Look on my website.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yep.
I'm just playing.
Was that when you were in Cairn as well?
The whole European adventure began when, it first began when, no, I won't talk about that. The whole European adventure began when in 1978 I heard that the film that Phil Noyce and I made, Phil Noyce's first feature film, Backroads, had been a great success at the Berlin Film Festival, and people like Werner Herzog and Wim Wenders and Fassbinder and other eminent directors in the German New Wave cinema at the time were most ecstatic about it. And so I conned the Aboriginal Arts Board into giving me a fare to Paris and a train ticket to the 1978 Cannes Film Festival, and got Phil Noyce to subsidise my partying around Cannes, and made a lot of connections with the likes of Wim Wenders and Werner Herzog, which in turn put us in touch with the German Greens, who at the time were extraordinarily well organised in German politics. And through our association and involvement with them, and Petra Kelly, the famous leader of the German Greens at that time, who was a friend of mine, we partly developed our idea of setting up a network in Europe to put pressure on the Australian government from that. So it was, in another way, it was yet another expression of Bill Onus's philosophy of using cultural a cultural approach, developing shows, performances, films, whatever, as a means of communicating with the world. It was through my involvement, which I'd partly learned from McGuinness, that was a legitimate sort of tactic. that led into, the Cannes Film Festival and led into the development of the European network.
I think we're getting to the end. It's something I was thinking. What message or messages do you think that Mac would most want to get out through this story? Well, if you could be channeling him now, what do you reckon he'd want to say?
I think he's messaged everyone I ever seen him talk to, and he did talk to a lot of people who, because of their circumstances and the circumstances of history, people who were the downtrodden and people who maybe lacked belief in themselves. And one of the most important lessons he always had for everybody was, first and foremost, believe in yourself, and don't let anyone ever tell you that you're less than what you know you are, and from that point on, your own self-improvement, the path to your own self-improvement rests within yourself and is reliant upon your own efforts. And anybody can do anything that they want in the world if they've got sufficient desire to do it. But the important thing that in what he was saying was that so many Aboriginal people suffer from an enormous lack of self-esteem, which is entirely understandable given our historical experience. And that, one of the first and foremost battles, that where you start is with the individual, and with the individual it begins with them being able to believe and sustain a belief in themselves. And then imagine the possibilities beyond. I mean, I went to university at the age of 46, following in Mac's footsteps. He went moderately late in life. He went in his 30s. But, it took me that long to get there for a lot of reasons, but in the end I went because I was still hearing his message about, self-improvement is possible and necessary. And, start with yourself and work beyond. If you can't change yourself, you can't change anyone else. He was a great man.